Welcome to Fulcrum Intel Digest, the podcast.
Imagine a terror group, one that seems to be, fading globally, but is actually quietly reshaping itself, expanding across a whole continent. That's the really concerning picture painted by our sources today.
We cover more topics like this every Monday and Friday. So if you'd like to stay up to date, click the subscribe button and give this video a like. Now let's jump in.
Today, we're taking a really close look at the Islamic State, ISIS, and its incredibly complex, constantly changing presence across Africa. For this deep dive, we're digging into a pretty comprehensive assessment from Fulcrum Analytics. It just came out this week, published Tuesday, February 11th, 2025. And it's not just a snapshot, right? It builds on their earlier work to give us this, detailed and frankly worrying view. So our mission for you, listening in, is to pull out the key nuggets about ISIS's ideology, how it even got into Africa, its changing goals, the hot spots where it's active, its successes, which might surprise you, its failures too, and crucially, what might happen next. We want you to really get the dynamics of this threat. Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. The report jumps right into ISIS's Salafi jihadist ideology. And it makes a point that it's not just, a simple set of beliefs. They call it a carefully constructed narrative. What makes this specific mix, this fundamentalist, puritanical Islam plus advocating global jihad? What makes it so potent? Why does it click with some people? The analysis suggests it's a calculated blend of religious ideas, historical grudges, and very real economic problems. It's about creating a sense of belonging and purpose.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating and quite chilling is how central the idea of reviving the historical caliphate is to this narrative. It's not just politics, it's this utopian vision, right?
Yeah.
A unified Islamic state, strict Sharia law, and that really hits home for people who feel completely let down by current systems, see corruption, inequality, and they kind of yearn for this imagined golden age of Islam. But here's where it gets particularly nasty. The report talks about takfir.
Yeah. Declaring other Muslims as apostates.
Exactly. And it's not just some obscure theological point for them. It's what lets ISIS justify extreme violence against a much wider group of people they see as enemies. They're not just targeting, say, Western forces. They target rival militants, government troops, even ordinary Muslims or civilians they decide are enemies or collaborators.
That really broadens their target list compared to others, doesn't it?
Massively. And it escalates the brutality. Then, connecting that back, ISIS is just brilliant at exploiting existing problems, political marginalization, economic hardship, sectarian divides. They step in and present themselves as the champion of the oppressed. And that approach, which Fulcrum Analytics also looked at back on January 26, 2025, is key to pulling in recruits from communities who feel, like they've got no other option.
That point about takfir is powerful. It really explains the seemingly indiscriminate violence. Okay, so turning to Africa itself, how did ISIS actually get a foothold and then, spread out? The Fulcrum report breaks this down into three clear, almost strategic phases. The first one, early infiltration. That was roughly 2014 to 2016. And this wasn't ISIS sending big armies from Iraq or Syria, right? It was more about existing militant groups in Africa pledging allegiance.
That's exactly it. Think of it as strategic co-option. This first phase was opportunistic for ISIS Central. They basically piggybacked on insurgencies that were already running rather than building something totally new. Big examples. Ansar Bayt al-Makis in Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, that was a key one. Of course, Boko Haram in Nigeria. These groups, already active, just rebranded as ISIS affiliates. Boom, ISIS suddenly had a much bigger map presence and operational capacity without sending many resources. It was like instant expansion on the cheap.
So they're basically slapping the ISIS brand onto existing fires. Okay, what happened next? How did they try to make that presence more solid?
Right. That leads into phase two, what the report calls consolidation and expansion. That's roughly 2016 to 2019. During this time, ISIS really tried to move beyond just the label. They worked hard to consolidate, setting up training camps, recruiting fighters directly, under the ISIS flag, and they launched more complex attacks to show they were serious, that they had territorial ambitions. They really fed off state weakness, political chaos in several African countries.
Like Libya.
Libya, absolutely. Post-Gaddafi chaos. Somalia, too, with its long-running conflicts. Even the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, weak central government there gave them room to dig in. It was a phase of deliberate, pushy growth.
That shift away from holding territory in the Middle East, it sounds like maybe a move born of necessity. But was it actually effective for them in Africa? According to the report, what was phase 3 then, from 2019 onwards?
It was definitely a pivot, yeah. And the report suggests it was actually pretty effective for their survival and keeping that global profile going. Phase 3 is adaptation and decentralization. After losing big chunks of land in Iraq and Syria, ISIS deliberately changed its strategy. They started relying much more heavily on their African affiliates to keep the brand alive, keep the momentum going. And what that meant practically was moving to a much more decentralized structure. Local commanders got more autonomy, more freedom to operate.
Which makes them harder to fight, I imagine.
Way harder. Decisions get made closer to the action. They could adapt faster to local realities, local resources. It's less top-down command, more like a network of semi-independent franchises.
Okay, that sounds like a real headache for counterterrorism efforts. So what does this mean for their actual goals in Africa? The big picture is still that global caliphate idea, but the report says their aims in Africa are more nuanced and adaptable to local contexts. What are those aims?
You're right. Decentralization doesn't mean they lack ambition. One clear goal is pretty straightforward. Establish territorial control in key areas. And this isn't just symbolic planting a flag. It's about getting resources, setting up training bases, creating logistics hubs. Often that means seizing natural resources, oil fields maybe, or gold mines, other minerals. That brings in cash.
Right, funding the fight.
Exactly. The report mentions specific cases like controlling artisanal mines, providing direct revenue. A second, really crucial aim is actively undermining governments. ISIS tries to chip away at the legitimacy, the authority of existing states. They do that through attacks on institutions, security forces, critical infrastructure. The idea is to create power vacuums, sow chaos and distrust in the government, which they can then step into.
Which raises a big question. With these kinds of goals, needing resources and manpower, how do they keep going and growing, especially if they're not always holding territory long term?
That's where recruitment comes in. It's a critical strategic aim. The Fulcrum report really stresses this. They pull in new members using a mix of things. Slick online propaganda tailored to local issues, that community outreach, sometimes disguised as aid or social work, and crucially, exploiting those existing socioeconomic problems we talked about. And it's targeted. There's a real focus on radicalizing young people, often those without many prospects. They get hit with intense ideology, that compelling caliphate story, and then military training. It's a very calculated approach that preys on despair.
The report then zooms in on specific areas, calls them operational theaters, where these ISIS groups are really active. It's kind of a stark map of how far this has spread. The Sahel region, for instance, described as a significant hub. Why there, specifically?
The Sahel is, unfortunately, like a perfect storm for groups like this. You've got weak governments, deep-seated violence between communities, and borders that are just incredibly porous, almost impossible to fully control. So in that environment, you see things like cross-border trafficking, guns, drugs, people even. Kidnapping for ransom is huge, a major moneymaker. And constant, often really brutal attacks on army posts, villages. The report notes how they sometimes leverage old ethnic tensions, stir up conflict, then offer protection to get their foot in the door.
Clever, in a horrible way.
Very.
And beyond the Sahel, the report also mentions the Lake Chad Basin. That's Boko Haram territory, right? We've heard about that area for years. What's the situation now?
Yeah, the Lake Chad Basin is still a major concern. Boko Haram officially pledged allegiance to ISIS back in 2015. They now operate as ISWAP Islamic State West Africa province. Now, various counter-terror efforts have definitely weakened them from their peak, but they are still launching devastating attacks on civilians, on security forces across Nigeria, Niger, Chad, Cameroon. The report points out how they've adapted. Less holding big territory, more hit-and-run attacks, focused on disrupting government services, aid delivery, making their presence felt even without fixed bases.
That pattern, exploiting local issues, adapting tactics, seems to be the common thread. Where else are these major operational theaters showing up?
We do see it repeated. Mozambique, for example. ISIS-Mozambique popped up around 2017. Locally, they were often called Al-Shabaab, though distinct from the Somali group. They've launched really significant brutal attacks in the northern Cabo Delgado province. And what's alarming there is how openly they exploit local anger about poverty, inequality, feeling shut out from the benefits of the region's huge natural gas finds. They basically tell people, we're your only way out of this marginalization.
Oh, wow.
And then you've got the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, there's the Allied Democratic Forces, the ADF. They're actually a Ugandan rebel group operating in eastern DRC.
Yeah.
They pledged allegiance to ISIS in 2019. The ADF is responsible for just horrific attacks on civilians, security forces. They really add fuel to the fire in an already incredibly volatile region. The report highlights their tactics often involve massacres, destroying infrastructure, just sowing terror and breaking down local life.
It's useful, I think, to look at both sides here. Where has ISIS actually had success in Africa, and where have they run into problems? The report lays out both. What are some of the key successes?
Well, despite all the pressure they're under globally, their successes in Africa are pretty significant, yeah.
Right.
First off, just the expansion of geographical reach.
Right.
They've managed to set up shop or inspire activity in multiple countries way beyond where they started.
Yeah.
Secondly, their recruitment of fighters. It's been surprisingly successful. They pull people from all sorts of backgrounds, locals fed up with their governments, foreign fighters looking for a new war zone, even ex-members of other militant groups wanting a stronger brand. And third, the inspiration of attacks. This is key. Lone wolves, small cells, inspired by ISIS ideology, carrying out attacks not just across Africa, but sometimes elsewhere too. It shows the ideology still has power, even without direct command.
So spreading wide, recruiting effectively, inspiring action far away, but they must face limits, right? Where have they stumbled?
Oh, definitely. Their influence isn't total, and the report points out some major limitations. A big one is their lack of sustained territorial control. Unlike their peak in Iraq and Syria, they've really struggled to hold on to territory long-term in Africa. They face pushback from local people, other militant groups like al-Qaeda affiliates, and of course, government forces.
So they can take ground, but not keep it easily.
Often, yes. Secondly, they frequently have limited popular support. ISIS's sheer brutality, and the fact they're often seen as outsiders, tends to alienate the very communities they need support from to survive long-term. And finally, they face significant counterterrorism pressure. Operations by national armies, plus international partners like France, the US, and regional African forces. That does take a toll.
That lack of sustained control, despite the wide reach, that's a really interesting point from the analysis. The report suggests it might actually be a more challenging strategy for counterterrorism in the long run, harder to pin down. So, given all this, what's the crystal ball say? What might the future hold for ISIS in Africa? The report sketches out a few distinct possibilities.
Yeah, it paints a few potential futures, none of them particularly comforting. Scenario one is continued decentralization. Basically, ISIS Central gives even more power to the local affiliates. They operate more autonomously. From a counterterrorism view, that obviously makes things way harder to track leaders, disrupt money flows. Scenario two is the idea of merging with other militant organizations. We've seen hints of cooperation sometimes. If that increases, you could see bigger, maybe more powerful alliances forming. Imagine a kind of consolidated terror network across the Sahel, for instance. That would be a whole new level of challenge.
And on the flip side, is there any scenario where they might actually weaken or break apart?
Yes, the report does consider decline and fragmentation. This could happen through sustained counterterrorism pressure, grinding them down, maybe internal splits and rivalries, weakening them from within, or just losing popular support as communities get sick of the violence. But, and this is the really important caveat in the report, even if the organization itself fragments, the ideology could easily persist, meaning it could still inspire attacks by individuals, small groups, even if the main structure breaks down. That core narrative, that idea, remains dangerous.
That's a chilling thought, the ideology outliving the group itself. Okay, so the report doesn't just analyze, it also offers recommendations. What needs to be done to actually counter this threat effectively?
The recommendations are pretty broad, acknowledging it's a complex problem. First and foremost is strengthen counterterrorism cooperation. Basically, everyone needs to work together better. More sharing of intelligence like the kind Fulcrum provides, coordinating military actions across borders, and providing better training and support to African security forces. They're often on the front line, but lack resources.
Makes sense. But military action alone rarely solves ideological movements, right? How do you stop people from joining in the first place?
Exactly. You've hit the core issue. The report heavily stresses addressing the root causes: poverty, inequality, political marginalization. That point was also really clear in that earlier Fulcrum analysis from January 26. It means investing in real development, pushing for good governance, actually resolving local disputes. Basically, taking away the grievances that ISIS exploits. Give people hope and opportunity, they're less likely to turn to extremism. It's about fixing the why. And the third big recommendation is to directly counter ISIS's propaganda.
The battle of ideas.
Precisely. Developing effective counter-narratives that show ISIS for what it is: brutal, hypocritical. Promoting media literacy so people can spot disinformation. And working directly with communities, especially local leaders, religious figures, young people, to build resilience against recruitment.
So wrapping this all up, It seems clear from the Fulcrum Analytics report that ISIS in Africa is this incredibly complex, shifting threat. There's no single magic bullet. It needs a comprehensive approach. Security, yes, but also development, governance, and tackling the narrative head-on.
Indeed. The situation needs constant watching, constant adaptation of strategies. The international community really has to partner properly with African governments and, just as importantly, with local communities. It's not just about stopping the next attack. It's fundamentally about building resilience, building hope in these regions, addressing those root causes that allow these groups to thrive.
So here's something to think about. If ISIS's ideology can live on, inspiring violence even if the main group splinters, what does that really tell us about the raw power of narratives, especially in a world full of deep-seated problems? What steps do you think are most vital to disarm these destructive narratives before they even take root?